All right, folks, today let's talk about fertilizer again. This video is going to be part 2 of a 3-part series. Our previous video discussed how to understand the nutrient concentration of the fertilizers you're buying, commercial fertilizers versus organic fertilizers, and a look at the value of some of the fertilizers you might buy in the stores. In this video, I'll explain to you how to figure out what types of fertilizers you might need to buy and the amount of fertilizers you might need to apply to see optimal results from whatever it is you're trying to grow. When talking about fertility for your yard, your garden, or your crops, everything starts with knowing what your soil is actually lacking and the nutrient needs of the plants that you're trying to grow. Now, you go to a doctor, would you want the doctor to prescribe medication to you without examining you or doing some blood work to figure out what it actually is lacking in your body? No, you wouldn't, and your plants don't want you to do the same with their fertility needs. Just like with animals and humans, a lack of proper nutrients can be harmful and lead to deficiencies impacting metabolic functions. On the other side, having too much of a certain nutrient can also be very toxic. Now, when dealing with fertility, everything begins with a soil test, knowing what concentration of nutrients are actually in your soil, but even more importantly, knowing what the pH of your soil is. The pH of the soil is perhaps the most critical aspect to growing plants. The vast majority of plants thrive in a soil that is slightly acidic, somewhere around the 6.5 to 6.7 range. And then, as you can see from this chart, all the needed elements for plant growth are mostly available for the plants to use in this pH range. As the pH of the soil decreases, important nutrients become less available and more minor nutrients like iron can actually become more available and actually become toxic to the plants. The same thing can happen, but to a lesser degree when you get into more basic soils with a pH above 7. Now, soils all over the world will differ in the natural acidity of the soil just based upon whatever the parent material that these soils were formed from. Now, there are ways for you to test the pH of your soil yourself with digital testers. I found some online, but without proper testing by a soil laboratory, you won't know how much lime or other products you need to add to correct the pH level, because you also need to know the buffer pH or the BPH in order to be able to determine how much, say, agricultural limestone you need to apply to correct the pH level in your soil. But these digital testers can be useful to see if you're right there in the right range. But again, you won't know how much product you need to apply if you're not in the correct range. So the first thing you need to do is to pull a proper soil sample and send it to, a designated lab. And instructions on how to properly pull the soil sample can usually be found from whichever lab you decide to use. Now, we prefer using Waypoint Analytical and have been using them for years, and it would be the one that I would recommend, but there are quite a few others out there. Just Google soil testing laboratories and they all perform pretty much the same function. Now, when actually pulling your soil samples, there's a couple different ways you can do it. We prefer to use a soil probe like this, and you push it down into the soil to about the 6-inch mark, pull it out, and it gives you a nice core of soil like this. And then, when we're testing, we just don't pull in one core. If we're wanting to test this area, we'll pull several cores from right here in this area, put them all in a bucket, and mix them together. But if you don't have access to one of these soil probes, you don't need any fancy tools. Just get you a shovel or a trowel or a spade, go in there and dig a sample about 6 inches deep, and mix all your samples together, and then put the designated amount in a Ziploc bag or a soil sample bag and send it to the laboratory. There's nothing really fancy about it. Now, for us, we pull a soil sample from every 2.5 acres. And this gives us a pretty representative analysis of what's going on in the field. Now, if you're at home and you just want to sample your garden or your yard, you know, if you got a relatively small garden, you know, I just pull multiple different probes from all around the garden, mix it together, send it in as one sample. If you've got a larger garden, or if you've noticed maybe problem areas in a specific area of your garden, you might want to test those separately. And if you're talking about your yard, you know, you might want to send in one soil sample from your front yard and then one soil sample from your backyard, because there could be some differences between the two. You know, ultimately, soil testing is relatively cheap. I mean, you can get a soil test done for probably around $10 per sample. And then after you send the soil sample into the laboratory, after the soil has been analyzed, they will send you the results showing the concentration of all the nutrients that's in your soil, the pH of your soil, and then if you happen to select a crop on the submittal sheet, they'll give you a recommendation of how much lime to apply and how many nutrients to apply to your area. Now, when you get your fertilizer results back, depending on lab you use, I mean, they could look quite a bit differently. One reason I prefer Waypoint Analytical is they give these nice, colorful soil test results back that let me easily visually identify, you know, where we're good and where we're lacking. But based upon the lab you choose, you know, your results could look quite a bit differently. You just need to know how to decipher the numbers on them. Now, the first thing we're going to look at on here is our pH. Like I said, that's the most important thing on this soil test, and it needs to be the first thing that you need to correct. See right here on this soil test, we got a pH of 6.1. A little below ideal, but we're not getting in the critical range. But because the pH will continue to drop as we apply commercial fertilizers and plants are growing, we need to maintain that pH, we need to go ahead and apply some lime. Now, looking down here at the recommendations, Waypoint is calling for 1,000 pounds of lime at this spot. Now, when looking at your recommendations, you need to see what the recommendation units are at. Like this one is in pounds per acre. If you fill out a sample for like a yard or a garden, I don't know, it might come in pounds per 1,000 square feet or so on. But anyway, if it comes back in pounds per acre, to do a little bit of conversion, there's 43,560 square feet in an acre. So if you got 1,000 square foot garden, you take that 1,000 pounds an acre divided by 43,560, and then multiply that times 1,000, tells me we need basically 23 pounds of lime spread across that 1,000 feet. And then looking down here on this soil test, shows we got a pH of 5.7. And Waypoint is calling for 2,000 pounds of lime. Now, how they figure that is they use the buffer pH that we see right below the pH to figure up how much lime it's going to take to raise the pH of that soil, because each soil is going to have a different cation exchange capacity right there. And one soil that's got a pH of 5.7 might need 1,500 pounds of lime to raise it up. Your next soil that might have a higher cation exchange capacity might need, say, 2,000 pounds of lime to raise a 5.7 pH up to where you want it to be. Now, when applying lime to your land to raise the pH, lime is not an instant process. It takes a while for the lime to kind of be broken down into the soil and rainfall to kind of percolate it down through the ground to raise the pH. So lime's typically effective for anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So you'll see your pH come up some in the first year, come up more in the second year, come up more in the third year. And what we like to do is we like to soil sample once every 3 years. If we were to soil sample every year and we'd apply 2,000 pounds of lime to our soil trying to raise the pH up, we would get a false result back on soil sampling the next year. It might show our pH as being like 5.9 the second year, and it would call for more lime. And then if we added more lime after that first year, you know, by the time all that lime was active in the soil, our pH would be, you know, probably well above 7. So you really need to give time for your lime to react in the soil before you pull a soil sample again and worry about applying lime again. And typically that's about once every 3 years. You can stretch that to 4 years or maybe 5 years, but the problem is that while the lime is raising the pH of the soil, at the same time, the fertilizer you apply, the crops growing on the soil, is going to be bringing the pH down. So once you reach the end of life activity of that lime, the pH is going to start coming down. So if you test, say, every 5 years, your pH might have dropped back down to a lot lower level, and you're going to have kind of a yo-yo effect. So I found out that soil sampling and liming about once every 3 years keeps your pH pretty nice and level. Now, after looking at the pH, the next thing we're going to start looking at are your macronutrients, your phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And if you notice, there's one critical nutrient that's missing on here, and that's your nitrogen. And that's because a soil test is pretty much useless to determine your nitrogen needs, because nitrogen is extremely mobile in the soil, and there's really no use of testing for it. You know, nitrogen does not attach to anything in the soil. It's basically contained in the soil solution, and as it rains and water infiltrates in through the soil, it's pushing soil water down lower in the profile, and any nitrogen already in the water solution will continue to be pushed down, and eventually it'll be pushed out of the rooting zone. So that's why nitrogen is not on the soil test, and you need to apply the amount of nitrogen that you need every single year, and preferably apply it at the right time so you don't run as big of a risk of the nitrogen being leached out through the soil. Now looking here at your phosphorus, you know, phosphorus is going to be an anion, whereas your potassium, calcium, and magnesium are going to be cations. So they need to be treated a little bit differently. Now, phosphorus, what we want to look for is around 70 pounds of phosphorus in the soil. That should get you right up there, right around the optimum level of phosphorus in the soil. As you see on this soil test, we've got we've got 32 pounds per acre in the soil. Now, your soil test might not come back as pounds per acre. It might come back as parts per million. But since in a acre slice of ground, there's about 2 million pounds of soil, to convert parts per million to pounds per acre is you multiply the parts per million times 2, and that gives you pounds per acre. That's why it's important that you pull your soil samples 6 inches deep. So anyway, for phosphorus, what you would optimally want to see on your soil test is a parts per million of 35 or a pounds per acre of 70. Now this test is showing 32 pounds an acre. So does that mean that I just need to go out and apply 48 pounds of phosphorus to get my soils up to an optimum level? No, unfortunately, it does not work like that. 1 + 1 does not equal 2 when determining the amount of nutrients in the soil. It's going to take far more than 48 pounds of phosphorus to bring our soil test levels up to 70, because the phosphorus fertilizer that you apply to the soil, not all of it is going to be plant available. Some of it's going to get tied up in the soil, and plants will not be able to extract it, and it will not be able to show up on soil tests. So there's really no knowing exactly how much phosphorus you need to apply to the soil to bring it up to a specific level. But if you're growing high yielding crops, I know I need to apply some phosphorus to this soil. Now, because it's testing right there in the medium, you know, for your yard or your garden that's not really nutrient intense, you know, a medium soil test level will probably be adequate for you. Not going to hurt to add some phosphorus, but there's also a chance that you really won't see very much response from adding phosphorus if your soil test is testing medium. Now, looking at this next soil test, you know, we got 164 pounds per acre of phosphorus in the soil. We're in the very high category. We most definitely do not need to apply any phosphorus to this. We actually need to draw the phosphorus levels in the soil down. So I would not apply any phosphorus to this land for quite a few years, because having too high levels of one nutrient can affect the nutrient availability of other elements in your soil. And then looking at this soil test, we got 12 pounds of phosphorus in the soil. We're on the low end of the low range. We definitely need to apply some phosphorus and probably need to apply a pretty good amount of phosphorus. You know, if I'm fertilizing for crops, you know, I'd probably add, you know, somewhere around 90 to 100 pounds of a phosphorus containing product to this piece of ground to try and build that up. Now that's not going to get me where I need to be, but it will start to bring it up over time. And, you know, for a lawn or garden with this type of reading, you know, I'd probably cut that in half. Now looking down below phosphorus, we start dealing with our cations, our potassium, our calcium, and magnesium. And it's important to not look at these individually, but as a group, because they kind of play off one another. Now, if you notice here on potassium, we've got 204 pounds an acre. Calcium, we got over 3,000 pounds an acre. And magnesium, we got almost 450 pounds per acre. But when dealing with cations, what I like to look at is over here on the right-hand side. You see where it says percent saturation or base saturation. That's what I like to pay attention to. Now, there's a theoretical perfect ratio between these four nutrients in the soil. Typically, potassium, we would like to see about 5% base saturation of potassium in the soil. Calcium, around 75% to 80% base saturation in the soil. And magnesium, around 15% base saturation in the soil, with hydrogen making up the rest. We don't want a large concentration of hydrogen there, because that's what leads to soil acidity affecting our pH. And you see right here, we got a medium test level potassium, got 188 pounds an acre. We got a base saturation of 2.6%. To get that potassium up closer to the optimum level, we need somewhere between 4 to 5% base saturation, targeting 5% base saturation. Calcium is right there in the optimal level, low optimal level, showing 71.3 base saturation. We'd like to see that, you know, up around 75, maybe even closer to 80, but usually not over 80, with magnesium being 11.1%. You see where it is on the chart. Need a little bit more magnesium. Now, for base saturation of calcium and magnesium is low, the best thing you can apply is dolomitic limestone. Dolomitic limestone has calcium carbonate in there, which is what lowers the pH in the soil, but it's also got high levels of calcium in there, and then also magnesium in there. So applying dolomitic limestone will bring your calcium levels and your magnesium levels up. Now, to increase the potassium levels, we need to apply potash to try and get that level up. Then you look at this soil test right here, we got really low potassium levels, 2.2% base saturation, but looking at our cation exchange capacity, because our cation exchange capacity is lower, it's not going to take as much potassium to raise this 2.2 up to 5% as it was the previous one. Then looking at magnesium, it's also testing low. It's testing at 5.2 base saturation. Then looking at this soil test right here, we got optimal levels of phosphorus, you know, over 70 pounds, and then we're real close to optimum on potassium, and it's showing 3.9%. I think 4% gets you right there at the optimum level, and then, you know, between 4 and 5% gets you, you know, about midways into the optimum level. You say calcium, we're right there at the optimum level at 71%. We ideally like to see that a little bit higher. And then magnesium is a little low right here. So for this right here, you know, looking at our pH, we got a 5.9 pH. We'd probably like to add dolomitic limestone. That would increase the calcium and magnesium some, plus it would also raise our pH. And then on the next soil test, if our pH is right about where we need to, but our magnesium is still low, we probably want to look at applying a product like K-Mag. Now, looking down here at another nutrient, sulfur and boron, which we didn't test for boron on this test because, for one thing, it's expensive, but another thing, sulfur and boron are a lot like nitrogen. They're mobile in the soil and don't stay around. very long. We used to get all the sulfur we needed from acid rain, but since we've really cracked down on emissions here in the US, we're not getting near as much sulfur from rainfall as what we used to, and now we need to apply it either synthetically or through the use of manures. And as I talked about in the first video in this series, you need to apply sulfur at about a 10 parts of nitrogen to 10 parts sulfur, a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you apply 100 pounds of nitrogen, you need to apply about 10 pounds of sulfur to keep it in the right ratio in the plant. Now, boron is a micronutrient and is needed in tiny quantities. You typically don't want to apply boron in a dry blend because you'll have one pellet of boron here, one over here, and one over here to apply the right amount of the soil, but it's not uniform in the soil, and plants are going to have a hard time reaching it. So when it comes to like your borons, your coppers, manganeses, zinc, that kind of thing, it's usually a lot better to apply those in a spray, to apply it foliarly to the plant. That way you get a uniform application, and because these nutrients are needed in such tiny quantities, it's a lot more effective in getting it into the plant, and it's also pretty cost effective too. Now, looking down a little bit farther, looking here at the organic matter right here, to me that's a very critical part of the soil test, because we're trying to build organic matter in our soil, because higher levels of organic matter only do good things when you're trying to grow stuff. The higher your organic matter level is, the more nutrients that your soil can actually supply to the growing crop, because organic matter is high in nutrients. Also, organic matter is like a sponge. The more organic matter you've got in your soil, the more water that your soil can store, giving you greater drought tolerance. And then not only that, all the microbes growing in the soil feed off that organic matter. So the more microorganisms you got in the soil, the healthier your soil is, the better that the whole biome in the soil works together to produce what plants need. Now, when thinking about how much fertilizer to actually apply, you know, we're talking about adding so many pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or whatever to the soil. Now, we're talking about actual units of nutrient you need to add to the soil. And then you need to convert that over to how many pounds of actual product that you need to add to the soil. So say you're wanting to add some nitrogen to the soil, you want to add 100 pounds of nitrogen to the soil. Well, if you're using urea, which is a common form of nitrogen, urea is 46% nitrogen. So you need, so to get 100 pounds of nitrogen in the soil, you need to actually apply 217 pounds of urea to get that 100 units of nitrogen. And then say you need to add 100 pounds of phosphorus to the soil using diammonium phosphate, or DAP, which has an analysis of 18-48-0. To apply 100 pounds of phosphorus, you would need to apply 208 pounds of DAP. But also that 208 pounds of DAP, because it's 18% nitrogen, would give you 37 pounds of nitrogen also. And if you needed to add 100 pounds of potassium to the soil using muriate of potash, which has an analysis of 0-0-60 or 60% potassium, you would need to apply 167 pounds of potash to the soil in order to get your 100 pounds of potassium. And to go along with all that, when thinking about which forms of fertilizer you want to apply, in some instances that can be very critical. You know, choosing which form of phosphorus, whether it's DAP or MAP, is really not all that important, because you're going for the phosphorus, and phosphorus does not move in the soil. Once you apply it, it will be there. Same way with potassium. If you're using a muriate of potash, or maybe one of the other forms of potash, you know, it really doesn't matter, because the potassium will be there and it's not going to move. However, when thinking about nitrogen or sulfur, using the correct form of product will be absolutely critical. You know, looking at nitrogen, you got several different major forms of nitrogen. You've got urea, you got ammonium nitrate, you got ammonium sulfate, and then you've got UAN, which is a liquid mixture of urea and ammonium nitrate. Now, some of the benefits of urea is that It might not be immediately available in the soil, but if you get a lot of rainfall, that nitrogen is not going to be leached out of the soil with your soil water like your ammonium sulfates and ammonium nitrates will. But that being said, nitrogen needs to be in either ammonium or nitrate form in order to be taken up by plants. So if you're using urea and you're needing to get nitrogen in the plant real quick, urea is not going to be the best source because it has to be converted into the nitrate form by soil microorganisms before it can be taken up into the plant. Conversely, if your crops need a quick dose of nitrogen, ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate or UAN, which is a combination of urea and ammonium nitrate, will be your best source because the nitrogen is already in the correct form to be immediately taken up by the plants as soon as that nitrogen has been incorporated into the soil. But if you're in a period where you're getting a lot of rainfall, some of that nitrogen may be lost through leaching. But that doesn't mean that urea can't be lost. Even though urea is not going to be lost in leaching with groundwater, if you apply urea and it hasn't been treated with a urease inhibitor, it can gas off in hot, moist conditions. That means you apply the urea to the soil surface, and if it's not immediately incorporated into the soil, it can kind of start evaporating and the nitrogen is returning back to the atmosphere where it came from. Now, the best way to prevent this is to either apply urea right in front of a predicted rain and hope it actually rains, or if you have access to irrigation, to water in that urea to get it down into the soil. Now, typically, depending on the time of the year, some forms of nitrogen can be better than others. Urea is typically better early in the season when temperatures are still cooler because it won't gas off as fast and return to the atmosphere, and there's a good chance you're going to get a rainfall to get it into the ground a lot sooner. Now, if you're looking at middle of the summer, maybe mid-growing season, you want that quick shot of nitrogen to get into the plant. You don't want that urea to volatilize and return to the atmosphere. So in that case, ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, or UAN is going to be a better product for you to use because the risk of using it is going to be lower. You're more likely to get more bang for your buck. Now, looking at sulfur forms, it can also play a critical factor. You've basically got two different kinds of sulfur. You can apply it in sulfate form like ammonium sulfate, potassium sulfate, or others, and that sulfur will be immediately available for the plant to take up as soon as it's been incorporated into the soil. However, these forms of sulfur can be quite a bit more expensive than using, say, elemental sulfur. Elemental sulfur has a lot lower use rate because it's 90% sulfur versus your ammonium sulfate at 24% sulfur, so you don't have to use as much product to get the sulfur that you need. That being said, sulfur is a lot like urea in that the elemental sulfur form is not able to be taken up by plants and has to be converted over to the sulfate form in the soil, and this process can take quite a bit longer than what it takes urea to be converted over to nitrate form. Sometimes it can take, several months, just depending on the conditions, the soil moisture, and the temperature of the soil on how long that actually takes. But if you're going to use elemental sulfur, typically you want to apply it very early in the season, preferably, maybe a month or two before you even plant, just to make sure that it's had time to start converting over and it's going to be available to the plant when the plant actually needs it. Well, guys, I know what we've been discussing being pretty complex. To some of y'all, it may be clear as mud, so I'm going to try to sum it up pretty simply right here. There's a few take-home points that you really need to pay attention to. Before you plant your first seed, first thing you need to do is get a soil test of where you're going to plant your crop. Because if you don't do this, you're just flying blind trying to figure out the right fertility recommendation for whatever it is you're trying to grow. Once you get that soil test back, the very first thing you need to pay attention to and try to adjust if needed is the pH of your soil. Because if you don't have the proper pH, it doesn't matter how much fertilizer you throw out there, the fertilizer is not going to be available and your crop's going to be and your crop is going to suffer. You got to get the pH adjusted first, and it can be a lengthy process. You know, it might take 1, 2, 3 years to get the pH where you need it to be, just depending on how low it is whenever you limed it. And then once you take care of the pH of your soil, then start paying attention to the nutrients you're applying, the amount of nutrients you need maybe to build your soils up to where they need to be, or the actual specific nutrient requirements of your crop. Now, I can't tell you the specific amount of nutrients to apply for every single crop because each crop is diverse. I would just recommend, you know, Googling whatever it is you're wanting to find out, you know, what are some standard recommendations on fertility use for whatever it is you're trying to grow. Well, now that we've completed the intermediate course on fertility, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty and see how we fertilize our crops, really taking some of these factors that we talked about and going to the next level with them, be sure to stay tuned for video 3 of this series. We're going to dive in deep to like a base saturation, you know, using some kind of yield goal to fertilize for, using crop removal rates to maintain optimum fertility. I'm going to show you some of the calculators we use to variable rate apply the nutrients to our crops, and really dive off into and try and get very, very specific with each crop that we grow. Guys, I appreciate y'all watching. Hopefully this video helped y'all out. If you'd like to support our channel, be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Lets YouTube know that we're doing a good job, and also lets YouTube know that you want to see more of that type of content. So guys, I appreciate y'all watching. Be sure to stay tuned for part 3 as we complete this series and telling you everything you need to know about fertilizer.